Hi, my friends.
My daughter Juniper stood in the center of our living room at 2 a.m., looking at me with a pity that was as fake as the emergency she'd invented to get us to sign our lives away. She thought the shadows and the late hour would make us vulnerable, but she forgot that a man who has spent a lifetime building skylines doesn't lose his vision just because the sun went down. Beside her stood Hollis and Arlo, two men who smelled of cheap ambition and expensive desperation, already mentally measuring my home for their own profit. They saw two aging parents who were slowing down, but what they were actually looking at was a trap they had walked into with their eyes wide open. I've lived through enough storms to know when the wind is about to change, and I don't need a weather app to tell me when my own roof is being threatened. My wife Veda stood by my side, her silence a sharp, cold blade that Juniper was far too arrogant to notice. We didn't need to shout. We had 40 years of experience and a legal strategy that was already closing around them like a steel vise. Juniper reached for the document, her hand trembling with a greed she couldn't hide, thinking she was finally taking what she felt she was owed. It's a bit ironic, really. She thinks she's the one holding the pen, but I'm the one who designed the ink. I let a small, dry smile touch my lips, the kind of expression that usually means someone is about to have a very expensive realization. She thought she was stealing our future, but she was actually about to witness the most spectacular collapse of her own. You might think you know how this story ends, but I promise you, the look on her face when the truth comes out is something you'll never forget. The trap wasn't behind us, it was already right under their feet, waiting for the first step. Juniper tapped her manicured nails against the kitchen table, her eyes fixed on the legal document she'd just slid toward me. She called it a simple asset protection plan, but the predatory glint in her gaze told a much darker story of greed and betrayal. I didn't rush to pick it up. Instead, I let it sit there like a piece of evidence at a crime scene. She thinks that because I've lived 6 decades, my reflexes have dulled, but she doesn't realize I've been watching her shadow for months. You and Mom aren't getting any younger, and this house is a lot of responsibility, she said, her voice practiced and hollow. I leaned back, folding my arms, maintaining a silence that I knew made her skin crawl with uncertainty. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments how old you are and where you're from. For you, it's just a small thing. But for me, it's the reason I keep telling these stories. I could hear Veda in the other room, her movements deliberate and calm, acting as the perfect silent partner in this chess match. Juniper had no idea that we'd already found the hidden cameras she'd tucked into the bookshelf last Tuesday. She viewed our home as an inheritance waiting to be liquidated, while I viewed it as the fortress I would defend at any cost. A slow, dry smile touched my lips, the kind of expression that usually precedes a very expensive mistake for the other person. Responsibility can be a heavy burden. Juniper, especially when you try to carry someone else's, I replied softly. I watched her blink, her false confidence wavering under the weight of my steady, unblinking stare. She thought she was the hunter, but as I looked at the signature line, I knew the only thing she'd be signing was her own exit from our lives. The trap was set, and the bait was exactly what she wanted, our total, silent compliance. Juniper started explaining wealth management with the same condescending tone she used when she was 6 and trying to teach me how to tie my shoes. She kept waving her tablet around, clearly under the impression that a bright screen would dazzle a man who survived the 80s without a GPS. It's a bit rich, really. She thinks I can't navigate a PDF, yet she still hasn't figured out that I'm the one who remotely disables the Wi-Fi when her business meetings in our guest room go too late. I had to suppress a smirk when she tried to explain digital footprints. This is the same girl who once got her head stuck in the stair banister because she wanted to see if she could fit. I watched her adjust her expensive glasses, a gift from us that was now being used as a prop to look down on us. The anxiety I felt wasn't fear of the future, but a sharp, cold realization of how deeply the rot of greed had settled into her heart. She was my daughter, but across this table, she looked like a stranger negotiating a hostile takeover of a family legacy. I took a slow, deliberate bite of my toast, the crunch echoing in the silent kitchen like a gavel hitting a judge's bench. I've built skyscrapers that stood against hurricanes, and I knew exactly which structural pillars in this conversation were about to buckle. Juniper leaned in, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper about security and long-term peace of mind. I wondered if she'd already decided which of our family photos were cluttered to be tossed into a dumpster during the move she was planning. Veda walked past, hummed a tune that sounded suspiciously like a funeral march, and winked at me when Juniper wasn't looking. It takes a lifetime to build a home, and only one greedy heart to try and dismantle it brick by brick. I sat there, a silent observer of my own betrayal, waiting for her to trip over the tangled web of lies she was weaving. Suddenly, her phone shivered on the table, displaying a message from a contact named Liquidation Pro that she wasn't fast enough to hide. My grip on the coffee mug tightened, not from tremors, but from the sudden, icy clarity of the battle that had just begun. Juniper didn't even wait for the coffee to get cold before she started decluttering my private study. I watched from the doorway as she tossed a stack of my original 1980s blueprints into a cardboard box labeled trash. My hands didn't shake, but my patience was having a very stern conversation with my temper. I'd spent the earlier part of the morning trying to negotiate with the new voice-activated smart thermostat Veda insisted on. I ended up shouting heat at a plastic disc like a confused king, only for it to tell me the weather in Berlin. It's the irony of the modern age. My daughter thinks I'm obsolete because I can't talk to a wall, yet she's the one throwing away the actual foundations of our life. She looked up, her expression a mix of pity and professional efficiency, as if she were clearing out a deceased relative's locker. These are just fire hazards now. Dad, we need to make the space look airy for the upcoming appraisal, she said, barely meeting my eyes. I stood there, leaning against the doorframe, letting the silence stretch until she finally shifted uncomfortably under the weight of it. I've lived through 3 recessions and an architectural revolution. I know exactly how to wait out a storm, especially one wearing expensive perfume. Every paper she crinkled felt like a calculated insult, but I kept my face as still as a frozen lake. She thinks she's clearing the path for her future, but she's actually digging a hole she won't be able to climb out of. Veda walked in, saw the mess, and simply placed a hand on my shoulder, her grip like iron under a silk glove. We didn't need words. We had 40 years of shared glances to communicate that the counteroffensive was ready. Juniper then took a call from Hollis, whispering about square footage and unencumbered titles while she paced over our oriental rug. The nerve of her planning a showing while my coat was still hanging in the hall was the final spark I needed. I realized then that she hadn't just lost her respect for us. She'd lost her soul to a spreadsheet. Hollis arrived at noon, carrying a leather briefcase and a smile that looked like it had been bought on installment. He shook my hand with that limp, damp grip that usually belongs to men who have never held a hammer or a secret. I spent 5 minutes trying to show him the smart lock I'd accidentally programmed to play a jazz flute solo every time the door opened, but he just stared at me like I was malfunctioning. He and Juniper stood in the center of the living room, whispering about flipping the floor plan as if I were a piece of furniture that had long ago lost its utility. They didn't even lower their voices when they discussed which walls were load-bearing and which ones were redundant, much like they clearly considered me. I stood in the corner, polishing a silver trophy from my structural engineering days, watching them measure the life out of my home. It's a curious thing to watch your own daughter estimate the value of your memories by the square foot. I've spent my life building things to last, while they've spent theirs looking for the quickest way to tear them down for a profit. Veda brought out a tray of lemonade, her expression so serene it was almost terrifying to anyone who actually knew her. She caught my eye, a silent signal that she'd already finished copying the contents of the encrypted drive Juniper had hidden in the laundry room. Hollis laughed at a joke Juniper made about moving costs, a sharp, brittle sound that echoed off the high ceilings I designed myself. I didn't join in. I just mentally recalculated the cost of the lesson I was about to teach them. They think our silence is a sign of confusion, but in reality, it's the quiet before the demolition of their little scheme. Every time Hollis tapped his expensive pen against his teeth, I added another zero to the metaphorical bill he'd eventually have to pay. I may have forgotten where I put my reading glasses this morning, but I certainly haven't forgotten the legal loopholes I built into this property's deed. When Hollis pulled out a contract and asked me to witness a minor document, I realized they weren't just stealing the house. They were trying to erase our existence entirely. I felt a cold, sharp thrill. It was time to let them think they had won. Juniper walked in with a glossy brochure for Silver Oaks, placing it right over my structural drawings, as if she were covering up a stain. She patted my hand. That slow, rhythmic pat people give to golden retrievers or the terminally confused. Hollis was in the hallway, loudly discussing estate liquidation into his headset with a voice that carried through the vents like a bad smell. I had spent the last hour wrestling with the new automated window blinds that Veda insisted on. I ended up trapped in a half-lit room like a character in a low-budget film noir. It was a minor tactical defeat, but the comedic image of me fighting a motorized curtain didn't stop Juniper from looking at me with profound, performative pity. It's for the best, Dad. A smaller place means fewer things for you to manage, she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. I looked at the brochure. The photos showed people my age playing shuffleboard with terrifyingly enthusiastic, empty smiles. I've designed dams that held back millions of tons of water, but apparently, my daughter decided I'm no longer qualified to choose my own morning view. I sat there, a silent statue in my own library, watching them debate whether my vintage record collection was retro chic or just clutter. Hollis actually had the audacity to sit in my leather wingback chair and put his feet up on the mahogany ottoman I built with my own hands. He didn't see the way I glanced at the loose screw I'd intentionally left in that ottoman's leg earlier that morning as a test. They are so busy counting the money they think they've already made that they've stopped looking at the floor beneath them. I took a deep breath, the air in the room thick with their ambition and my growing, cold resolve. Veda walked by and subtly adjusted the thermostat to Arctic blast, leaving Hollis shivering while she smiled at him like a benevolent saint. It wasn't just a house they were trying to take. They were trying to auction off my dignity before I was even out the door. As Hollis leaned back, laughing at his own cleverness, the ottoman gave a sharp, sudden crack, and I felt the first real spark of the fire that was about to consume their plans. Juniper spent the afternoon walking through the halls with a roll of red stickers, marking everything she deemed excess inventory. I watched her place one on the grandfather clock that has kept the rhythm of our lives for 30 years, her face as cold as a bank vault. Earlier, I'd had another skirmish with the robot vacuum Veda bot. I called it the traitor because it always seems to wait until I'm deep in thought to attack my ankles. I didn't stumble. I simply performed an unplanned inspection of the hardwood floor, which, I noted with satisfaction, I had installed perfectly in '92. Juniper gave me that look, the one where she talks to me like I'm a particularly slow toddler, asking if I need to sit down. I simply dusted off my trousers and informed her that I was merely checking for termites, a joke that went entirely over her head. The humor is my shield, but inside, a quiet, freezing rage was crystallizing into something unbreakable. To her, this house is a pile of equity. To me, it's the physical manifestation of every sacrifice I ever made for her. Hollis was outside on the lawn, showing a potential buyer the view as if he already owned the horizon. I saw the red sticker on the photo of Veda and me on our wedding day, and that was the moment the last thread of my restraint snapped. I didn't shout or storm out. I simply walked to my desk and picked up the ledger she thought I'd forgotten about. My mind is still a precision instrument, and I began calculating exactly how much it would cost her to realize her mistake. She thinks she's clearing out a dusty old man, but she's actually inviting a wolf into her carefully constructed lie. I caught her reflection in the hallway mirror as she smiled at a sold sign in her bag, and I realized the game wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about survival. I turned the key in the bottom drawer, ready to reveal the one document that would turn her perfect world into a pile of ash. Juniper came into the kitchen at midnight, her face a mask of false empathy, telling me there was a paperwork emergency that couldn't wait until morning. She looked exhausted, her ambition finally starting to fray at the edges, while I felt as sharp as a newly honed blade. My smartwatch buzzed on my wrist, a gift from her that constantly tells me to stand up when I'm already walking, or to breathe as if I've forgotten the basic mechanics of survival. I looked at the flickering screen, then back at her, and dryly remarked that if I breathed any deeper, I'd likely blow her entire house of cards down. She didn't laugh. She hasn't had a sense of humor since she decided a 401k was more important than a soul. Hollis was idling in the driveway with his lights off, looking like a low-rent villain in a movie no one would pay to see. They think 2 a.m. is the hour of the vulnerable, the time when old minds are foggy and the shadows are long enough to hide a theft. They don't realize that for a man who spent 40 years supervising night pours on massive construction sites, 2 a.m. is when I am most awake. I signed the emergency disclosure she pushed toward me, using the specific fountain pen Veda, and I had prepared for this very moment. I watched Juniper's hand tremble slightly as she took the document, her greed finally outweighing her composure. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of pity, not for myself, but for the daughter who thought she could outmaneuver the man who taught her how to think. I stood up, my posture as straight as a steel beam, and walked toward the bedroom where Veda was waiting with the final piece of our plan. My knee gave a small, traitorous pop, and I whispered to the empty hallway that my joints were merely applauding the upcoming performance. I took one last look at the hallway I'd painted myself, knowing that by dawn, these walls would be protected forever. Juniper was already whispering into her phone, telling someone that the coast is clear and to bring the buyers to the back entrance. The sound of tires on the gravel at 2 a.m. wasn't a surprise. It was the starting gun for the final act. I handed the invisible baton to my wife, knowing she was about to finish what I had started with a precision that would leave them breathless.
I heard the floorboards groan not from age, but from the weight of Thatcher's heavy, purposeful stride as he entered the bedroom. He handed me the pen like it was a relay baton, his eyes gleaming with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had just laid the last brick of a fortress. I was sitting in the dark, my sleep tracker app vibrating to tell me I was currently in a deep REM cycle, which was news to me as I watched Hollis creep across the lawn like a cat with a guilty conscience. Juniper thinks I'm the gentle one, the grandmotherly soul who spends her days knitting and searching for misplaced ginger biscuits. In reality, I've spent the last 48 hours rerouting her private estate sale invitations to a very specific group of people she never intended to invite. The headlights of a black SUV cut through the oak trees at the end of the driveway, a cold intrusion into the sanctuary we built over 40 years. Hollis was out there, waving them forward with a flashlight, looking as small and insignificant as a termite on a cathedral door. I didn't reach for a weapon. I reached for the tablet Juniper had donated to me to keep me occupied, the one I'd used to mirror her every email. I checked my reflection in the darkened window, smoothing my hair. If I was going to witness my daughter's ultimate betrayal, I would do it looking like the queen of the castle she was trying to steal. There is a specific kind of silence that falls just before a structural collapse, and I was breathing it in, savoring the chill. She thinks we are the prey, huddled in our beds and lost in the fog of years, but she's forgotten that the mother bird is the one who knows exactly how to push a predator out of the nest. I watched the car doors open, and my pulse didn't even quicken. It just slowed into a rhythm of cold, hard focus. As the buyers stepped into the light, I realized Juniper hadn't just brought investors. She had brought the one person who could make this betrayal permanent. The game had moved from a simple theft to a total erasure of our legacy, and I was ready to strike. Juniper was downstairs, her voice a forced, high-pitched chirp as she welcomed the night owls into our foyer at 2 in the morning. I moved to the landing, my footsteps as silent as the secrets I've kept for decades to protect this family. Thatcher was right behind me, trying to slide into his slippers in the dark and accidentally putting both feet into one oversized house shoe, a blunder he handled with the silent, stony dignity of a fallen emperor. He didn't curse, he just stood there, balanced like a crane, until he corrected the situation with a sharp, dry look at me that said, "Don't you dare laugh." I didn't. My eyes were fixed on the man standing in our entrance hall, shaking Hollis's hand with a grin that made my blood turn to ice. It was Arlo, the man who had tried to bankrupt Thatcher 20 years ago, the one person my husband had explicitly banned from ever stepping foot on this property. Juniper was showing him the original crown molding as if she were selling a cheap suit, completely oblivious to the shark she had invited into our living room. She had dug up the one name that served as a specific wound in our history, all for the sake of a quicker commission and a clean break. I felt Thatcher's hand tighten on the banister, his knuckles white, but his breathing remained as steady as a metronome. "She really went and did it," he whispered, a sound so cold it could have cracked the window panes in the dead of winter. Hollis was pouring Arlo a glass of our vintage bourbon, the bottle we'd saved for our 50th anniversary, acting like he'd curated the collection himself. It's a strange, hollow feeling to see your own child treat your life's work like a clearance rack at a closing department store. I reached into my pocket and felt the cool metal of the backup key, not to the house, but to the safe deposit box that Juniper didn't know existed. She thought she was being clever by bringing in a motivated buyer in the middle of the night, but she had just handed us the perfect legal justification to strike back. I watched Arlo run his hand over our dining table, and I felt a surge of clarity that replaced every remaining ounce of motherly hesitation. As Arlo pulled a checkbook from his coat, I realized the debt he thought he was collecting was about to be paid in a currency he wasn't prepared for. Arlo was actually leaning against our fireplace, looking around like a conqueror assessing a newly seized territory. Juniper handed him a pen, our pen, and I could see her hands shaking, though she tried to hide it by smoothing her skirt. Thatcher, beside me in the shadows of the landing, tried to pull out his tactical high-intensity flashlight he'd seen on a late-night commercial, but he accidentally hit the SOS strobe setting instead. For a split second, the hallway looked like a 1970s disco, and Thatcher muttered that at least if we were going down, we were going down with flair. He clicked it off with a dried dam technology and went back to being a shadow, his presence still radiating a pressure that seemed to dim the lights below. I watched my daughter's face. There was no love there, only the frantic calculations of someone who had spent her entire life trying to outrun her own mediocrity. She had sold her parents' peace to a man who once tried to destroy us, and she was doing it with a smile that barely reached her chin. The room felt smaller, the air thick with the smell of expensive cologne and cheap desperation. "It's a steal at this price," Arlo, Hollis whispered, and I felt a pang of regret that I'd ever let that man across our threshold. I looked at the clock. It was 2:15 a.m., the exact moment the legal transfer she thought she was signing became a trap of its own. She didn't know that Thatcher had updated the deed into a life estate trust 4 hours before she arrived. She was about to sell something that technically and legally she had no right to even touch. Thatcher nudged me, his face a mask of iron, reminding me that the best time to reveal the truth is when the opponent thinks they've already won. I began to descend the stairs, my hand sliding down the railing I'd polished every week for years. Arlo froze with the pen midair, his eyes darting toward the stairs as if he'd just seen a ghost from his past. The look on Juniper's face suggested she finally realized that the helpless old people were standing right in front of her. I reached the bottom step, the cold marble floor greeting my feet with a familiarity that Juniper had clearly forgotten. Arlo looked as though he'd just seen his own bankruptcy papers come back to life, his hand trembling slightly as he pulled the pen away from the contract. Thatcher stood behind me, looking like a statue of retribution, though he was currently preoccupied with his smartwatch that began loudly congratulating him for reaching his daily step goal in the middle of the confrontation. He simply tapped the screen with a dry, "Not now, you glorified kitchen timer," and returned his gaze to Hollis with an intensity that made the younger man take a step back. Juniper's face strained of color, shifting from a triumphant glow to a sickly, pale gray as she realized we weren't in bed dreaming of retirement homes. "Mom, you should be asleep," she stammered, her voice cracking like thin ice under a heavy boot. I didn't answer immediately. I simply walked to the sideboard and straightened a framed photo of our family, the one taken before she learned how to lie with such precision. The silence in the room became a physical weight, pushing Hollis toward the exit, though his greed kept his feet glued to the rug. I've spent years teaching Juniper about the importance of a solid foundation, yet here she was, trying to build her future on the shifting sands of a stolen deed. I looked at Arlo, seeing the same desperate, hollow man Thatcher had defeated decades ago, now reduced to sneaking into homes at 2 a.m. "The bourbon you're drinking is older than your career, Arlo, and far more sophisticated," I noted, my voice as calm as a winter morning. Thatcher moved to the door, his large frame blocking the only exit, looking less like a retired engineer and more like a mountain that had decided to move. He let out a small, dry chuckle when he realized he'd left his reading glasses upstairs and couldn't actually read the contract on the table, but he didn't need them to know it was a lie. It's a shame to waste such a beautiful night on a crime that's already been foiled, he said, leaning against the frame with a terrifyingly casual posture. Juniper reached for the document, her movements frantic and disjointed, finally seeing the predator in the parents she had tried to cage. I stepped forward, placing my hand over hers on the table, feeling her pulse racing under her skin like a trapped bird. The emergency disclosure she had Thatcher sign wasn't what she thought it was, and the look in her eyes as I flipped the page told me she'd finally seen the trap door opening beneath her. Juniper tried to pull her hand away, but I held it with the surprising strength of a woman who has spent 40 years kneading bread and holding a family together. She looked at me, and for the first time in years, she saw the woman who had built this life, not the aging mother she wanted to archive. Behind me, Thatcher was trying to look intimidating, but he was currently engaged in a silent, desperate struggle with a loose thread on his sweater that had somehow caught on the door handle. He didn't panic. He just snapped the thread with a sharp tug and gave Hollis a look that suggested the man's career was about to meet a similar, abrupt end. "You think we're slow, Juniper," I said, my voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room I'd personally chosen the acoustics for. "You think because we forget where we put the remote. We've forgotten how to recognize a snake in our own grass." Arlo was sweating now, the expensive bourbon clearly souring in his stomach as he realized the document Thatcher had signed was actually a formal notification of a pre-existing lien. I watched Hollis try to slide his briefcase toward the door, but Thatcher simply cleared his throat, a sound like a landslide, and the man froze mid-motion. It's funny, really. They came here expecting to find two people fading into the twilight, but they found the two people who own the sun and the moon in this house. I finally let go of Juniper's hand and slid the Real document across the table, a revocation of her inheritance rights based on the moral turpitude clause we'd added yesterday. Her eyes scanned the page, and the shock was so profound that she actually stumbled back, knocking over a vase of dried lavender I'd been meaning to replace anyway. Thatcher chuckled, a dry, rasping sound, and remarked that at least the decluttering was finally starting to show some progress. The tension in the room was so thick you could have sliced it with the silver cake knife Juniper had already marked for the estate sale. Arlo stood up, his face a mask of fury, realizing that by signing his check, he had actually admitted to a conspiracy to commit fraud in front of witnesses. I looked at my daughter, and the heartbreak I expected wasn't there, only a cold, hard clarity that she had never really known us at all. "The police are already at the end of the driveway, Juniper," I said, checking my old-fashioned wind-up watch that never needs a satellite to tell the truth. The door chimes rang, not the jazz flute Thatcher had accidentally programmed, but a sharp, authoritative knock that signaled the end of their little midnight auction. The heavy oak door swung wide, admitting the sharp, rhythmic pulse of police lights that painted our foyer in shades of blue and crimson. Juniper's legs finally betrayed her, and she sank into the very chair she'd marked for sale, looking like a ghost in her own manufactured nightmare. Hollis tried to shrink behind a large potted palm, but Thatcher simply pointed at him with a cold, steady finger while simultaneously trying to fish a stray mint out of his pocket. He accidentally pulled out a crumpled grocery receipt instead, examined it with a dry inflation is a crime too, and then returned his piercing gaze to the shivering realtor. The lead officer, a man who had helped us find our lost dog a decade ago, picked up the contract with a look of profound, professional distaste. I stood perfectly still, watching the predators realize they had been the ones in the cage all along, their greed having blinded them to the most basic legal realities. Arlo tried to stammer a justification, but Thatcher cut him off by simply holding up a hand, a gesture of such absolute authority that the room went silent. "You always were better at spending other people's money than earning your own, Arlo," Thatcher remarked, his voice as dry as autumn leaves. He then struggled for a brief, undignified second to close his tactical flashlight, eventually just shoving the glowing tube under his arm like a glowing baguette. I looked at Juniper, waiting for the familiar pang of motherly pity, but found only a quiet, resolute sense of peace that the battle was finally over. She had underestimated the two people who had spent 40 years mastering the art of the long game while she was still learning to lie. The officers began the quiet, orderly process of removing the intruders from our sanctuary, their boots thumping against the hardwood I had polished into a mirror. Juniper looked back one last time, her face a mask of shock and newfound realization that we were never the victims she imagined us to be. I walked over to the mahogany table and picked up the for sale listing, tearing it slowly and deliberately into four perfect pieces. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the sound of a house finally breathing again after a long, suffocating fever. As the last cruiser pulled away, Thatcher turned to me with a look that said the final reveal was still waiting in the safe upstairs. The house was finally silent, the kind of stillness that only comes after a storm has been cleared from the foundation. I watched Thatcher meticulously reorganize the silver trophy he'd been polishing, though he accidentally knocked over a small ceramic owl in the process, catching it with a reflex that would have made a 20-year-old envious. He grumbled something about anti-gravity ceramics and set it back down with a wink, his composure as unshakable as the walls he'd built. We walked upstairs together, our shadows merging on the wall, two architects of a life that refused to be liquidated. I opened the small safe in the library and pulled out the original deed, not to this house, but to the land Juniper thought she'd already sold in her mind. She never realized that the guest house she'd been living in for free was legally a separate entity, one we had transferred to a local charity for veterans hours ago. It was our way of ensuring that while she looked for a new place to live, her greed would finally serve a purpose higher than her own bank account. Thatcher sat in his favorite chair, finally successfully deactivating his smartwatch, which let out a mournful beep before falling silent. "I think I'll stick to the sun for telling time from now on," he remarked, his dry sarcasm a soothing balm for the night's events. We didn't need a victory parade or a grand speech to feel the weight of our triumph. We had protected our sanctuary, not through luck, but through the hard-earned wisdom that our daughter had mistaken for obsolescence. Juniper will learn that a home isn't built of square footage and appraisals, but of the loyalty of the people who inhabit it. I brewed a fresh pot of tea, the steam rising in the quiet kitchen as the first hint of dawn touched the horizon. We are not broken by the years. We are refined by them, like steel forged in a fire that only the brave can withstand. Thatcher leaned back, took a sip of his coffee, and smiled the calm, steady smile of a man who knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. We stood our ground, we kept our dignity, and in the end, we reminded the world that experience is the one asset that can never be stolen.
It's been 6 months since the night the lights of justice flickered in our hallway, and the house has finally stopped echoing with the footsteps of those who tried to steal it. Juniper moved to a rental across town, a cramped space that finally matches the size of her ambition. Small, unremarkable, and entirely of her own making. She calls occasionally, her voice thin and full of a regret that sounds more like exhaustion than true apology, but I've always been better at building bridges than rebuilding trust that was intentionally burned. Arlo is currently navigating the complex architecture of a multi-state fraud investigation, a project that will likely keep him occupied behind bars for several years to come. Hollis vanished from the local real estate listings as quickly as a bad smell and a breeze, his license revoked and his reputation permanently in tatters. Veda and I spent this afternoon on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors no appraisal could ever hope to value. My smartwatch buzzed to tell me my heart rate was slightly elevated, but I knew it was just the simple, quiet joy of knowing my front door only opens for those who are invited. We haven't changed a single thing in the house, except for the locks and the way we look at the horizon with absolute, unshakable clarity. I've learned that peace isn't the absence of conflict, but the ability to win it so completely that it never dares to return. We are still here, standing firm, two pillars of a foundation that no amount of greed could ever hope to shake or dismantle. The garden is thriving, the house is silent in all the right ways, and for the first time in decades, the air feels entirely pure. We didn't just save a building, we reclaimed our right to our own peace of mind, and that is a victory that will never fade.